We are taught that the world only became globalized in the last century. We think of the internet, the shipping container, and the stock market as the inventions that tied humanity together. But 3,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was already a spider web, a machine, a single integrated engine of trade that stretched from the tin mines of landlocked Afghanistan across the Hindu Kush all the way to the amber coasts of the Baltic Sea. Imagine the year 1200 BC. If you were a king in the Mycenaean Greece, your palace was decorated with ivory from Central Africa and lapis lazuli from modern-day Afghanistan, a blue stone so prized it was worth more than gold by weight. Your scribes kept records on clay tablets. Your soldiers carried swords made of bronze, a metal that required two ingredients almost never found in the same place: copper and tin. To make a single blade, you needed a supply chain that spanned entire continents. You needed diplomacy. You needed roots. You needed stability. Here is a fact that most people never learn. Archaeologists working at the ancient port city of Uluburun off the coast of Turkey discovered a Bronze Age shipwreck that tells us everything. Dated to around 1305 BC, this single vessel was carrying 10 tons of copper ingots, 1 ton of tin, glass ingots from Egypt, ebony logs from sub-Saharan Africa, ivory from Syria, spices from Canaan, and a golden scarab bearing the name of Nefertiti. 1 ship, 10 countries, every item irreplaceable. It was a golden age, but it was also a golden cage, because when every kingdom depends on every other kingdom just to survive, a single spark does not just start a fire, it triggers a total systemic blackout. Tonight, we're going back to the year 1177 BC, the year the engines stopped and the lights of the world went out. We know the end was coming because we can still read the panic in the clay. In the ruins of the city of Ugarit, a port city on the coast of modern-day Syria, archaeologists found a letter. It was lying in a kiln, still wet, waiting to be hardened and sent by ship to the king of Cyprus. It never left the city. The letter reads, and I want you to really hear this: "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came here. My cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country. Does my father not know that all my troops and chariots are in the land of Hatti, and all my ships are in the land of Luca? Thus the country is abandoned to itself." The king of Ugarit was stripped bare. His army was abroad. His navy was elsewhere. He was alone. And while the clay was still cooling in the kiln, the city was razed to the ground, burned so completely that modern archaeologists can still see the char marks on the walls. Here is the scale of what was lost. Ugarit was the Wall Street of the Bronze Age. It was the hub through which all the wealth of the Eastern Mediterranean flowed. Its scribes could write in 8 different languages. Traders from Egypt, the Aegean, Canaan, Anatolia, and Cyprus all kept warehouses in its port. In a single afternoon, or perhaps a single night, it was gone, erased so thoroughly that the city was not rediscovered until a Syrian farmer accidentally plowed into a tomb in 1929. But who were these enemies? Who were the ships that came from what the Egyptian records called the midst of the sea? They are known to history by a name that sounds like a myth: the Sea Peoples. They did not leave records. They did not build cities. They did not write poetry. They only destroyed. We see them for the first time, and almost the last, in the Egyptian temple reliefs at Medinet Habu, carved in stone by the order of Pharaoh Ramesses III. Warriors in distinctive feathered headdresses, appearing in massive fleets, carrying their families and their cattle behind them. They were not just an army, they were a migration, a desperate, uprooted tide of human beings who had lost everything and were coming for whatever was left. Who were they? Scholars have debated this for over a century. Some groups are named in the Egyptian records: the Peliset, the Checker, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Weshesh. The Peliset, many historians now believe, are the people the Bible later called the Philistines. Others may have been displaced Mycenaean Greeks, Anatolians, or Cypriots, people who themselves were fleeing from the very catastrophe they were now spreading. This is the terrifying paradox at the heart of the Bronze Age collapse. The destroyers were also the destroyed. The refugees became the raiders. The Sea Peoples were the easy villains of the story, but modern science has assembled a different picture. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the collapse. They were a symptom. They were the vultures circling an empire that was already dying of 1,000 cuts. To understand what really killed the Bronze Age, we need to look at the sky, the ground, and the ledgers of the kings. If you look at the ancient tree rings from the Eastern Mediterranean, the dendrochronological record that scientists extracted from fossilized timber in Syria and Cyprus, you see a terrifying pattern. A prolonged, devastating drought that gripped the region from approximately 1250 BC to 1100 BC. This was not a bad harvest. This was a multi-generational crisis. Pollen samples from lake sediments in the Sea of Galilee show that rainfall in Levant dropped by up to 50%. The agricultural systems that fed the armies and the cities simply began to fail. At the same time, and this is where it gets almost unbelievable, a sequence of major earthquakes struck the region. Archaeologists call it an earthquake storm. The palace at Pylos, immortalized in Homer's Odyssey as the home of wise old King Nestor, was burned and abandoned around 1180 BC. The tablets found there showed administrators desperately shuffling soldiers from one threatened border to another in the weeks before the end. The last record is a list of rowers being requisitioned. Then, silence. Famine led to internal rebellions. Rebellions disrupted the roads and the ports. Disrupted ports cut the supply of tin. And when the tin stopped flowing, the bronze stopped being made. The superpowers of the age, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Canaanites, were like dominoes. They were so tightly interconnected, so mutually dependent, that they had no resilience. When one fell, the shock wave pulled the next one down with it. By the time the Sea Peoples reached the borders of Egypt in 1177 BC, they were not fighting a world power. They were picking over the bones of a civilization that had already collapsed from within. While the rest of the civilized world was burning, one man refused to go quietly. Pharaoh Ramesses III, not to be confused with his more famous namesake, Ramesses the Great, was watching the horizon with cold, calculating eyes. He knew the Sea Peoples were not merely raiding, they were relocating. They were bringing women, children, cattle, and ox carts, the full weight of a displaced population, bearing down on the Nile Delta, the breadbasket of his empire. On the great stone walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu, which still stand today near Luxor, he recorded what happened next in extraordinary cinematic detail. Ramesses did not meet the Sea Peoples in open water. He lured them in. He allowed them to enter the narrow, treacherous channels of the Nile Delta, where the currents turned against them and their sails became useless. He lined the shores with thousands of Egyptian archers hidden in the reed beds and behind the earthen banks. When the enemy fleet was fully committed, when there was no room to turn and no wind to run, the air turned black with arrows. The Egyptian warships, smaller and oar-powered, rammed the invaders from the flanks. Men were dragged from the water with hooked poles. The reliefs show Egyptian soldiers counting the severed hands of the defeated, a grim accounting system for tallying the dead. The inscription boasts that the Nile ran red for days. Ramesses won. Egypt survived. But the victory was hollow. Because while Egypt preserved itself, everything else was already gone. The Hittite Empire, Egypt's great rival and occasional ally, had ceased to exist. Its capital, Hattusa, had been burned to the ground and abandoned. The palace cultures of the Aegean were rubble. The trading cities of the Levant were ash. The King of Kings had defended a border that no longer led to anything. He had saved the last candle in a world where all the other lights were already gone. Now we come to the part of the story that most history books quietly skip, the hidden mechanism that ensured there would be no recovery. Remember the recipe for bronze, copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan or Anatolia or beyond. When the sea peoples destroyed the ports and the drought killed the pack animals on the overland routes, the supply chain snapped. Not slowly, like a dry twig. Without tin, you cannot make bronze. Without bronze, you cannot make weapons, tools, plows, or the fittings for ships. The most powerful armies on earth, the remnants of the Egyptian, Hittite, and Canaanite forces, found themselves carrying weapons they could not repair and could not replace. A broken sword was no longer a setback, it was an irreplaceable loss. The Bronze Age did not end because someone invented a better technology. It ended because the supply chain for the old technology was murdered. Civilization did not collapse. It ran out of parts. But this is where the story makes its turn. Because in the dark, in the rubble of the old world, something new began to stir. Metalworkers across the former Bronze Age world, desperate and resourceful, began experimenting with a material that had always been available but always been dismissed: iron ore. Iron ore is one of the most abundant materials on the surface of the earth. You can find it in almost every country. But for centuries it had been considered a trash metal. The reason was temperature. To smelt iron properly, you need a furnace that can sustain over 1,200 degrees Celsius, far beyond what a bronze furnace could achieve. The technology simply did not exist. But necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention. Beginning around 1100 BC and accelerating through the following 2 centuries, smiths in Cyprus, the Levant, and later Greece began to crack the problem. They learned to use charcoal, not wood, to achieve higher temperatures. They learned that if you folded and hammered the iron repeatedly while it was hot, a process called work hardening, you could produce a blade of remarkable toughness. They learned to add a tiny percentage of carbon during the forging process and discovered almost by accident that the result, what we now call steel, was stronger and held a sharper edge than any bronze weapon in history. Then they learned the final secret: quench the blade in cold water at exactly the right moment. The sudden thermal shock locked the crystalline structure of the metal, making it hard enough to hold an edge, yet flexible enough not to shatter. This was the pivot that changed everything. Bronze was the metal of kings. It was expensive, rare, and controlled by the palace economies that had just collapsed. Iron was the metal of the people. You could mine it almost anywhere. You could smelt it in a relatively simple furnace. It was, in the most literal sense, the democratization of power. For the first time in human history, a farmer could own a quality iron plow. A common soldier could carry an iron sword that was, man for man, better than the weapon of the palace warrior he had spent his life fearing. As the great empires, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Canaanites faded into the ash and the silence, a massive power vacuum opened across the Levant and the Aegean, and into that vacuum stepped the small, the overlooked, the forgotten. Without the Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians, a collection of small city-states on the Lebanese coast, would never have dominated Mediterranean trade. With the old gatekeepers gone, they sailed freely, founding colonies as far west as Carthage in North Africa and Cadiz in Spain, and crucially, spreading their simplified alphabet, the ancestor of the Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Hebrew alphabets, to every shore they touched. Without the collapse, the Greeks would not have had the space to develop their revolutionary model of the city-state, and a small group of highland pastoralists in Canaan, a people called the Israelites, would never have established the kingdom that produced the texts that would shape 3 of the world's major religions. We call it a dark age, but for these people, the Phoenicians, the early Greeks, the Israelites, it was a sunrise. The collapse of the giants cleared the ground. The end of the old world was the only condition under which our world could begin. We look at 1177 and we see a mirror. We see a world that was too connected to be simple and too complex to be resilient. A world where efficiency had been optimized so completely that there was no slack left in the system, no backup route, no stockpile, no margin for error. The Bronze Age did not end with a single catastrophic battle. It ended with a cascading sequence of quiet, interconnected failures. A drought here, a broken port there, a missing shipment of tin, a palace that could no longer feed its scribes. No single king caused it. No single king could stop it. The system had simply become too brittle to bend. The scholar Eric Klein, whose landmark book, 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, brought this story to a modern audience, put it this way: the collapse was a perfect storm, a systems failure, not a singular event. Every element of that storm exists in some form today. Globalized supply chains, climate pressure, mass migration, the fragility that comes with complexity. History does not repeat, but it does echo. And right now, if you listen carefully, you can hear it. I'm your host. This has been The Midnight Storyteller. Sleep well, if you can. If this episode changed how you see the world even slightly, share it with one person who would appreciate it. That's all. No algorithm needed. Just one person. I'll see you in episode 3.